I've received a lot of emails from people who have found themselves in the situation where they are preparing for their death. They have a terminal illness. And I think it would be nice to talk about how to start preparing for death and what that would look like, as well as touch on the topic of the fact that a lot of people have near-death experiences, but they are not pleasant. They encounter some sort of negative realms, hell realms. So, yeah, after my car accident, after my near-death experience, I went from thinking about death in like a logical sense. Of course, we're all going to die one day. You know, we all know that. We just don't think about that because our ego, whose job it is to keep us alive, doesn't like to think about death. So intellectually we know it's going to happen, but it's not really in our periphery. It's not really in our awareness. Maybe if you've had someone very close to you die, or you've had a near-death experience, or you've had some sort of ego interruption that was extremely sudden and profound and just left you with your head spinning, then you'll know what I'm talking about. The ego program of just feeling strong and in control is so set aside, and you realize that your awareness is not going to be in this body forever, and that can be a little bit shattering and frightening. And as uncomfortable as those experiences are, they're usually pretty brief. And in the best case scenario, they lead towards dramatic shifts in the way that you show up in the world, the way that you behave, the way that you spend your time and energy ongoingly. So, in my opinion, they're huge gifts. They're huge gifts if they happen to you. If you get the gift of a major ego interruption, what's happening is you're basically switching from looking through the eyeglasses of the ego and seeing things through the eyeglasses of the ego to just having awareness without a filter, just having a knowingness. And that knowingness is of a higher degree and contains much more truth than the ego awareness. And that doesn't mean the ego awareness is bad. It just means it's more of a big picture way of looking at things. And usually we don't stay in these higher levels of awareness that high constantly because it's not practical. It doesn't really serve day-to-day life on earth. But these temporary shifts into that, if we can learn what we need to learn and see what we need to see, and then return into our ego awareness, then we can have a big transformation in the way that our ego goes about life. We can draw on that temporary experience of seeing from a big picture, a higher perspective, and we can choose to switch into seeing like that more often and choose to switch out of only seeing through an ego consciousness. And so after my car accident, after my near-death experience, I spent about 1 year as a hospice volunteer, as a companion to people who were dying, who had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. And before that, I had been working as a paramedic, and part of our job was to drive people from the hospital over to hospice, where they would eventually die, or from home to a hospice, or from home to the hospital where they would have an appointment for an assisted suicide or euthanasia. So you could say that I've been around quite a few people in my adult life who were coming face to face with death and were in the death preparation phase of their life. And they didn't all experience that the same. There was quite a big spectrum. One man that I was a companion to at the hospice, I actually knew him, this elderly gentleman that I knew from my town. had been diagnosed with terminal cancer and found himself in the hospice. He was in his 70s. And when I knew him from town, he was always a very, very assertive, verging on aggressive guy. He was very pragmatic. He was a bit of a know-it-all. And kind of an angry gentleman, I would say. And when I met up with him in the hospice, and I hadn't seen him in a while, he had lost a lot of weight. He was no longer in control of his finances, his whereabouts for the future on Earth, or his bodily functions for that matter. He was now finding himself in a diaper and in a lot of pain, in a lot of physical pain. So a lot of things had changed about his attitude. This kind of ornery guy had turned into a very nervous, physically weak, and slightly mentally unstable person. When I first got there, he was still a little bit more with his feistiness. You know, he liked to watch the news and he'd ask me my opinion about the different things they were talking about. So it started off like that. But over the months, things started to really go downhill. He lost even more weight. He slept more. But what's important about this story is he started talking about things that were troubling him. And the events that he was talking about were nothing new. They were things that had happened like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Things that he conveniently didn't probably think much about in his day-to-day life before his diagnosis. His regrets about how he treated his son. His shame and discomfort when he would think about how he treated his ex-wife. Those were the two main things that he was quite stuck on. So when I would go and sit with him, often the topic of conversation was this loop, this round and round loop about what he had done, and he just felt horrible about. Because now with no distractions, you know, he couldn't go out and about. He's lying in this hospital bed in pain, and all he can think about is what's showing up. And so he was finding himself in an ego interrupting situation. He no longer had the physical strength and the power and the status to avoid thinking about this stuff. And it was really troubling him. And so what seemed to be happening was things that he had shoved into the shadow, suppressed, kind of thrown into the subconscious and just conveniently never thought about. The veil had been torn down and all of it was flooding back through. And he was visibly distraught. You couldn't really console him. Nothing you said really could matter. It was really up to him to sort through these things and to sit with it. And so week after week I would go and he was just very agitated and troubled about these topics. And you know, I think eventually as he kind of went round and around and around, he started to make some peace. He started to make some peace about what had happened. And then near the end, he became much more dreamlike. He would kind of be in and out of being awake. He still recognized me. He called me by my name. But he would do things like he'd point over to the corner and say, "Amanda, can you tell those people to be quiet? I'm trying to talk." And there was no one in the room. And I smiled because I realized that he was moving into the next dimension. He was literally transitioning. And if you've been around a person who's dying, you realize that the dying process with a terminally ill person is not often black and white. Their spirit is starting to shift and let go of the body and see more, experience and perceive more of what's going on in the spirit world right around them. So of course I couldn't see these people that he was talking about in the corner, but he could see us both. And it was so real to him that he thought that I could also see those people and tell them to be quiet. So we had some interesting times where he would see things like that in the room, but he didn't think that they were anything special or supernatural or interesting, because to him it was just as real, just as real as I was. So he's a great example of somebody that had a lot of sorting out to do of his unconscious. I would say even like a little bit of a version of shadow work that was forced on him. There's another woman that I drove in the ambulance from her home to her appointment for assisted suicide. She had very recently gotten the diagnosis of terminal cancer, and she decided that she did not want to suffer. She did not want to get cancer treatments. She did not want to suffer through the pain of a, terminal cancer situation. So she made the decision to have an assisted suicide quite early on in her diagnosis. She was a little bit more mobile still than this other gentleman. And I picked her up from home, and we had about a 30-minute drive together to the hospital for her appointment for her death. And there was some very obvious, some very obvious trepidation and non-peace about the situation. She didn't say too much, but what she did say led me to believe that she had a lot of unfinished business, whether it was with other people or just conflict within herself, that she was headed into her death with. And those aren't pleasant rides. Those are really intense rides to have with people. So I think it's important, if you're in a position where you are with a terminal illness, or you are related or close with someone who's got a terminal illness, and you find yourself in a death preparation situation, or just close to somebody who is, to really tune in, whether if it's your family member, tune in to what they're saying in between the lines and ask questions, when it's appropriate. And if it's you, to notice what's coming up as far as unfinished business, what's coming up as far as regrets, things that you aren't proud of that happen in life. Because often things will start surfacing that you think you've completely forgotten about, or that you have completely forgotten about, and you're surprised that you're face to face with them at this point in your life journey. And without proper guidance and support, a person can find themselves in a really dark place while they're coming face to face with their regrets. This is not necessary, though. This is not necessary. And this is why, as healthy and well people, it can be something to consider to embark on shadow work. To start sorting through these situations and these regrets in our subconscious while we're well. And if you approach shadow work and sorting through these things in the proper way, and that is with compassion and tenderness, it can be a beautiful process. And it can really free up a lot of energy for you. When we do things that cause harm to other people, or things that cause harm to ourselves if we don't honor ourselves, when we're extremely critical and judgmental and harsh with the way that we speak to ourselves, it's not that different than if you're doing it to other people. When we treat ourselves or other people poorly, it's not because we're bad people. Often it's out of fear, it's out of trauma, or not wanting to re-traumatize yourself. After my car accident, I started to have a spontaneous life review that went on, I would say, pretty heavy for almost 4 years. And how it looked was I would just lie down for going to sleep, or I'd just be, going into a meditation. And suddenly I was face to face with a memory of something that had happened to me a traumatic event, or something that a way that I had behaved towards another person that I really regretted, that really I had no excuse for doing. And so through these 3 or 4 years of having this spontaneous life review of all these memories starting to stream forward, I realized, whoa, there's a lot that I suppressed and shoved into the shadow. I shoved away, never considered them again. And now they're all coming up because my ego had been interrupted. And so now the veil had been removed between the conscious and the subconscious, at least a little bit, enough for information and memories to stream through. And I had a lot of support from some really wise people during those years. So that's something that is really important when you're doing shadow work, because it's really easy to beat yourself up. Some things that would kind of stream forward, I used to work in group homes for young women, and some of the young women were very, very tough. They were often violent, very manipulative, very sneaky. It really took a lot to be neutral, respectful, and kind, especially working long hours. So I remember a memory coming forth from those years, just a spontaneous memory of the way that I treated one of those girls when she was having a violent outburst. So instead of just completely following protocol and, protecting myself and just following up, I said some nasty things to her. And suddenly I was right back. It was like it had just happened, and I was feeling a lot of remorse. Because truthfully, she didn't deserve that from me. Even though she was acting, a little bit out of line, very much out of line, I was her caregiver. I'd been entrusted with her care, and I was supposed to follow a specific protocol. And she was acting like that because she was a traumatized person and something had re-triggered her trauma and she was acting out. And so we all make mistakes. We all make, tons of mistakes over the course of our life. But during these ego-shattering experiences, these end-of-life months, or, for some of us, like a life review during our lives, it can be really hard on us to see how we've showed up in the world. So approaching ourselves and the hidden things in the shadow with a lot of tenderness is very integral. We act out and we're harsh when we're frightened, when we're re-triggered from an old trauma and we're afraid we're going to get hurt again the same way. And so we try and protect ourselves sometimes by lashing out at other people to try and keep them away, to warn them, don't hurt me. I'm going to hurt you first. Don't hurt me. This is stuff that we do. So we're not doing these kind of things because we're bad people. We're doing them because we don't have the tools and we don't have the balance inside of ourselves to show up any differently. And so when a person has a near-death experience, or they actually do leave the body and die, and they have what they would describe as a visit to a spirit realm that is dark or difficult or hellish, it's not so that they can go there for everlasting punishment. These are realms that cause us to face what hasn't been faced. That is the purpose. It's a purification. And if we aren't facing those things during life, if we aren't actively sorting through those things that we don't really want to look at, a time is going to come that they are going to be in our face, whether we're lying in a hospice bed with nothing to do, or we've actually, had a sudden death and we're finding ourselves in a spirit realm that is not pleasant. Either way, we are going to have to face what needs to be faced. And it's not a punishment. It's literally a purification. It's a clearing. If we came to Earth to, be in like an Earth school, to learn lessons and to develop our soul, and we still have things in our subconscious from our lessons and we haven't processed them or learned from them, then we can't move on to the next grade. We can't move on to the next grade. We have to finish up everything that's unresolved, all the loose ends. And it doesn't even necessarily mean that you have to make amends with everyone in your life that you've wronged or anything like that. Where possible, of course, that's going to be helpful for everyone involved. But what shadow work really is having the courage to look at how you've showed up towards yourself or someone else. Have forgiveness and tenderness and understanding for those behaviors. And try and make a connection about why, the motivation of why you would have done something like that. And for the most part, it's because you probably felt a little chaotic and out of control and unresourced and unsupported or triggered, trauma triggered. Finding that forgiveness for yourself or for another person. You know, sometimes these things that come up are things that have kind of come at us and they've traumatized us. And in that case, it's understanding why that person would have acted like that and not taking it personally. And if we're committed to doing our shadow work, you know, during life when we're healthy and well, we'll be much, much more prepared for our eventual death and leaving the physical body. Because that's what's going to happen. The whole of yourself doesn't die, just the body dies. But your awareness is going to move on. It's going to move on to other dimensions. But it can't go to higher dimensions if you're still weighed down with baggage, unresolved baggage from your subconscious. It doesn't compute. You can't ever be in a high dimension where it's only truth and it's only love if you're still having things that you haven't learned. Because those things that you need to learn, that you need to sort through, that is the gold. You know, it sounds uncomfortable and it sounds kind of nasty to be looking at these things that happened in the past. But actually, if you can do that, if you have the courage to look at those things with curiosity and tenderness and forgiveness and leave them where they are, that brings a lightness. And you'll be more prepared to leave the body when it's time. I think in the West, a lot of us, especially if we've been influenced by organized religion, and we have these ideas of hell that are literally Bible verses that are misconstrued and pulled out from, you know, medieval times in order to frighten people and control them. Some of us think that we don't have those things and we're over that and we're positive and we're not afraid of those things. But I would encourage you to, if you've been exposed to that, especially as a child, to consider that there could be unresolved fears that are hiding in the subconscious about a negative experience after dying, about getting stuck in hell or something like that. And these aren't topics that you really get excited to consider, but it's better to approach them now than find that you're facing fears by yourself when you're, you know, in your last days. It's important to know that even if you are somebody who has come from organized religion, that if you really do a little bit of research, you'll realize that a lot of those Bible verses were literally talking about what I'm talking about a purification, a temporary visit where you face what needs to be faced, and those attachments and those illusions and those regrets all get burned away just simply by you facing and looking at the content. And it can feel pretty hellish to revisit things that you thought that you'd never think about or see again. But don't get caught up with the story from organized religion that there is an eternal hellfire and brimstone that literally was just to control and frighten people, you know, back in, you know, the Dark Ages. And if you're someone who watches the near-death experience videos and you're hearing about people who have visited the negative realms, the hell realms, just really listen to what they're saying. Listen to what they've taken from it after and how they've done their integration and what they've learned from it. Because those realms are not to punish us forever. Those realms are literally temporary so that we can get our purification. But even better is to do our work now. To spend a little bit of time, with your journal and writing out, things that you regret or you don't like thinking about, or, ways that you've treated yourself or other people over the years. And, doing a bit of journaling about that. Talking to someone you trust. Talking to a counselor about that. And that way, you're releasing those stuck energies, those stuck memories from the subconscious, and you're just letting them move through so that they don't weigh you down anymore. And that would be the best thing that you could do if you're in the position of preparing for your death. If you're one of those people, to remember that death is just leaving behind the physical body. The physical body will fall asleep and never wake up. But you will pass on to higher dimensions. You'll pass on to home eventually. You'll return and remember where you came from eventually. You'll be reunited with loved ones, even loved ones that you don't remember you had from other lives in those other dimensions. You'll move into dimensions where you're experiencing more of a oneness and an interconnectedness with everything that's ever been created. You'll realize how interdependent we are. You'll be outside of time where you can explore. You'll go home. So if you feel like you need to do any preparation now, start looking at the attachments and the illusions and the regrets. Start forgiving yourself. Start talking to people about these things. And that way you're going to leave here a lot more lighter.